you think about carbon, we've lost over 90% of our grasslands across the country. And our grasslands are more reliable at storing carbon than forest. Yet our solution to that is to plant more forest. And this is coming from a forester, somebody who loves trees and forests. I think the answer is right there in front of our eyes, and we're blinded by the trees. We can't see the forest for the trees, but we can't see the grasslands for the trees, I guess.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now. The farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Good morning, Good Dirt listeners. Welcome to the Good Dirt Podcast with Mary and Emma. We're here. Coming at you from Washington, D.C. and outside Washington, D.C. on a little farm, respectively, in Maryland. Right, Mom?
Yeah.
That's where you are. So if you're new around here, you might not know that my parents moved from Washington, D.C. out to a farm about 10 years ago now. And it's been a really wonderful experiment in slow and sustainable living. And that's where Lady Farmer was born and all this really fun stuff. And since day one, Mom, you have been dreaming and doing all your little projects and interesting things. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on outside.
Yeah.
And your garden and, the animals and all that. So more recently, I think a bigger project that you got excited about was native plants. So can you tell me a little bit about what you've been doing at the farm in regards to native plants and what that even means?
Yeah, I'll start out by saying that this whole adventure of living on the farm and seeking out permaculture and real food and growing food and being more connected to the land, it's such a learning all the time. Every season brings in new revelations, new information to absorb, and it's so exciting, continually inspiring. Always just keeps us moving forward onto the next thing. And so, as you said, Emma, more recently, in the last, I would say 2 or 3 years, we've been tapped into this native plant project on our land. So this land that we live on, which is only 7 acres, but formerly it was farmland and grazing land. And the more we've learned about good dirt and restoring soil and creating habitats and that sort of thing, the more we've come to realize that we don't need so much grass. We don't have that many animals to graze. And we can do away with some of the pasture and start creating more areas where we can grow native plants. So we started out in the front. There was this big grassy plot in the middle of our circular driveway. So we converted that area from just grass that had to be mowed every week in the summer. And we started putting native plants there a few at a time. And it's such an amazing thing to watch because just so quickly after you start doing that and you start getting the blooms and you start getting the things that are supposed to be there naturally, you also get a return of the life that's supposed to be there naturally, like the pollinators and the birds and the insects and the butterflies and all of that. And it's something that you get feedback on so quickly as to how it's an enlivening the environment. So we've really got the bug now, and it's so much fun. It's actually, once you get these things in there, it's less work. We don't have to mow anymore. I can get cut flowers from there a lot. I can collect seeds from there. And it's also just absolutely beautiful. So we're looking around to other parts of the property. Where can we get rid of grass? Where can we put in more natives? Where can we grow things that belong there that haven't been replaced by invasive grass species or pasture grasses or things like that that were originally at a time when this particular piece of land was more agricultural, used to raise livestock and so forth. So that's the story of what we're doing here the last couple of years. And I was just noticing this morning, I'll look out my front bedroom window, and that patch that we've so recently converted to natives, it's an ever-changing picture of the seasons.
Yeah, that front area right outside the front of the house.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Every time I go visit, I feel like it's just there's so many new plants and things going on. And
Yeah, you drive up, it's the first thing you see.
yeah. I will say too, for those in the city, in DC specifically, I can speak to, if you are in a house or a townhouse or somewhere that has a little green space, this might not apply if you are in an apartment, but if you have any green space that you're responsible for, you are entitled to this rebate program through the Department DOEE, Department of Energy and Environment. And we actually had someone come out. So you get an auditor to come out. Basically, it's a stormwater audit. And the whole goal is to get cleaner storm runoff going into the river as much as possible. And then they tell you things you can do. And then they'll help you pay for it. And one of those things that is actually free is that they will come and plant native plants in your green spaces.
Wow, I did not know about this.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's called the River Smart Home Program. And we actually did it a few months ago. And as like many things in the government, there's a long waiting time for it to be done. So maybe that'll get done in the next year. I don't know.
Is this something for DC specifically?
What I'm speaking to specifically is the DC DOEE River Smart Program. But like many things I mentioned on here that are specific to DC, I imagine that there might be similar programs in other cities. So I would definitely look into that at the DOE or the DOEE or whatever program that your city has. And you might be able to find something really cool like this. So native plants, all about it.
Yeah. And no matter where you are, even if you have just a patio, you can create a mini environment that attracts native species and pollinators and so forth. And you can contribute on whatever small scale to this effort.
Totally. So speaking of doing your part and having an impact, a great place to start with that is the Lady Farmer Slow Living Challenge.
Oh, yeah.
It's a really fun challenge that we do every year, and we're doing it again this year. It starts February 6th. If you're interested in joining us and slowing down and being more sustainable and learning step by step, really breaking it down, we will send you prompts. We will send you inspiration. It's through email, so you do need to sign up even if you're already getting our newsletter and everything we send out. You'll need to sign up for the Slow Living Challenge separately at the link in our show notes, and we will be doing it with you. And it's always such a fun community building experience. So if that sounds like something fun and you want more good dirt in your life, that's where you're going to get it, man. At the link in our show notes. Sign up for the Slow Living Challenge.
And even if you've been with us for a while, maybe you've done the Slow Living Challenge every year. And sure, there might be some overlap from year to year of the concepts and the topics and so forth. But remember that we're always evolving in our own process, and we're always at a different place. So even if you think, oh, I've done that before, come on and join us again. You're gonna be surprised at how far you've come, or what's newly inspiring to you, or what you're ready for that you weren't ready for before. So yeah, come on in. Let's do it.
Totally. Yeah. So back to the subject at hand, native plants, and today's guest. We are so excited to introduce Kyle Lybarger. He is a forester and conservationist from North Alabama. He has a forestry degree from Alabama A&M, and he tells us in the conversation, but he truly gained this really organic interest in overlooked grasslands in his area around where he lives. And he started making videos about it on TikTok and Instagram and has amassed a huge following, rightfully so. His videos are really great, entertaining, super informative. And he was so great to talk to and so knowledgeable. He knows so much.
And as so often on this podcast, I learned so much. I really didn't know about all these grasslands. I didn't know that so many of our forested areas were once actually native grasslands and how they were managed by the animal life that was around or the native people that lived here. And since we have shifted so much in our country to agriculture and the native peoples have been displaced, and so their practices have gone away, we really have shifted our domestic landscape here in the United States. And his mission is to tell people about this and tell them what's going on. And it was really fascinating.
Yes. I really loved this episode. I love talking to Kyle. He has his own podcast. It's called the Native Habitat Podcast. And as I say many times in this episode, and I still believe it's true, Kyle Lybarger for President 2024. I'm starting the campaign here. Grassroots. Get it?
Yeah, grasslands, grassroots. Yeah. So great. So we'll let him take it from here. You're going to love this. Here's Kyle Lybarger from the Native Habitat Project and the host of the Native Habitat Podcast.
My name is Kyle Lybarger. I'm from North Alabama. I'm a forester, graduated forestry school from Alabama A&M in 2017. Worked for the State Fish and Wildlife for 3 years while I was in college. And then for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been private forester. So I've been buying timber, been on a lot of private properties, working with private landowners, like helping them manage their forest and helping them figure out how to do it properly and leave the best forest for the next generation as possible. And my wife and I started a native plant nursery, I guess right when COVID started, early 2020. So I had been collecting a bunch of native wildflower and grass seeds for 2 or 3 years before that, just to use in my own landscaping. And we ended up starting that nursery just behind our house and selling at farmers markets on the weekends. And we had that going for 2 years. And this year we kind of took the year off, and we really need to probably upgrade sites, and it kind of outgrew our backyard. So we got to figure all that out before we start it back up. But that's kind of the gist of who I am. But married, I have a 9-year-old stepdaughter, and we have a little boy on the way in December.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, exciting. So is your organization, the Native Habitat Project, is that associated with your native plant nursery, or is that something else?
It's a long story, but while I was a forester, I was on a bunch of different private properties, and I was coming across a lot of different plants, and I realized how little I learned in forestry school. I realized there's a ton of trees and plants and grasses and things that we never learned. And so that kind of piqued my curiosity. And so I started paying attention to a lot of those plant species and trying to learn anything that I could identify. And so by doing that, I started coming across a lot of rare plant species, rare ecosystems, grasslands. And people don't realize this, but most of North Alabama was grassland ecosystems. And we think everything in North Alabama used to be forested. And so even I did. I graduated forestry school thinking all of North Alabama used to be a forest, and it wasn't. I was finding all these grassland species mixed into these forests, and when we would remove some timber, bring some sunlight to the ground, all these grassland species would come back. And so I started, I guess that ignited my passion in native plants, and so we started the nursery. Mostly, I was growing those plants. I was like, okay, I'm going to use these for restoration projects and trying to restore different prairies. And most of my customers ended up just being home gardeners, especially selling at the farmers markets. We had a lot of people coming up there specifically to buy natives from us, but then we had a lot of people who were just saw these native wildflowers and wanted to buy them. And from there, I was like, well, I realized there wasn't a whole lot of education on it. There's about a million things that got me to that point, but I realized, how uneducated the public is on what's around us and all these native plants. And so, I started posting everything I found on these private properties. I'd take pictures and share them at the end of the week, and people seemed to like that. So I started making videos, and I was horrible at it. I can't even go back and watch some of the early ones. They were horrible, but for some reason, one of them went kind of viral on TikTok and kind of started my path down creating content and educational content about native plants and native ecosystems. And then everybody was like, well, you're managing all these places. What are you called? Like, what are you doing? And I was just the guy who was I'd find these rare grassland ecosystems, and I'd knock on the person's door and I'd be like, hey, can I burn this part of your property to see what comes back? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. They'd give me access to collect seeds and burn and things like that. And people were like, so you're just a guy doing this. So I kind of had to give it a name, and that's when the Native Habitat Project was born. So
That's awesome.
Right. So from what I heard you say, Native Habitat Project is, on your part, is kind of an exploration and experimentation. And also you provide content to educate people on the importance of native plants and what's around them.
And for anyone listening who hasn't seen Kyle's videos, he's gotten very good at making videos. I don't know. I haven't seen your old videos, I guess, but I can't listen to our early podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And before that, we had webinars. Oh.
The best thing to be successful at making videos or podcasts, I think, is getting past that and just not caring.
Mm-hmm.
Not caring how you sound, and you'll get better at it. And people, one day you'll be like, wow, how did I get to this point? Because I feel like I'm still know nothing about making videos or editing videos and feel like I'm a novice still. But apparently I've gotten better at it, I guess. So.
The first thing is to not curl up in a ball and crawl under your bed when you hear your voice on on a recording.
Yeah,
that's the first hurdle.
That's the worst part.
Yeah, that was really hard.
What's awful is when you're in public and you pull your phone out and somehow the volume's turned all the way up and you open it and it's on one of your videos and it just starts blaring. So it looks like you're watching one of your videos in public.
Oh, no.
That's the worst. That's the cringiest. But that's kind of the foundation of what we do is creating educational content, because I think that's really the wall that needs to be knocked down. People just don't know about what's around them. They don't know about these native plants. And we used to, not too far back, several generations back, we knew more about these plants and these ecosystems and how to manage them. Around here, people were burning off mountains every year because that's what they did. In the valley just up the road from me, the Native Americans were burning those areas off, and then the Europeans just kept following and doing the same thing, burning those mountains off. And then I guess 60, 80 years ago, probably people stopped burning like they used to. And so a lot of these grasslands and places grew up and became closed canopies instead of savannas, and they turned into more forested areas. All these open grasslands were overgrazed or turned into crop fields, and the modern practices is use every square inch you could possibly use. And so there was no room for these native grasslands. They would till every bit of ground they could, or they'd overgraze every bit of ground they could. And now that's turned from doing that to people building on every piece of ground they can, or mowing every square inch of their property that they can.
Tell us about why burning was a common practice and is now sort of a revived practice.
So it was a natural process that would, it happened naturally through lightning strikes and things like that. But Native Americans burned everything off. A lot of the times, there was about 1 million reasons why they burned. It was good at reducing tick populations. It was good for bringing in wildlife, different game animals. And so it increased biodiversity. It kept these places open. The more sunlight you get to the ground, the more plant diversity that's going to be there. And so they would burn everything. And now it's just not as common of a practice. People don't do it nearly as much because we've built roads. They would literally burn from one creek to another, and just hundreds of miles they let these fires go, and then there was nothing stopping them. And now with all our roads and houses, we're not able to do that, so we have to do it on a smaller scale. But back then it was a lot more common. Almost every year they were burning. And then prior to that, we had in North America, we had mastodons and mammoths and elk and bison that were in the southeast that people don't realize. And those are grassland species. They're a lot like Africa, where you have elephants and large herbivores pushing over trees, keeping areas open, keeping areas from growing up into timber. Young saplings always got consumed by those herbivores. So we took away North America's ability to do that with the large herbivores, and then we had to fill that role ourselves with fire. And now we've stopped filling that role. And so grasslands are disappearing, and for them to return and is kind of dependent on us. We have to make that initiative and then make that decision to manage these places. And the whole mindset of just letting things go and not doing anything to those ecosystems, and they'll take care of themselves. That doesn't work when you've removed the large herbivores and you've removed the native people and their practices of burning the land. We can't just sit back and let those ecosystems take care of themselves. It unfortunately doesn't work like that anymore. So.
Yeah, we like to think sometimes if we just leave nature alone, she'll do her thing. And to some degree, that's completely true. But also, then we forget that we are part of nature. And the indigenous people knew that really well. And they knew the role that they played. They knew exactly what to do. I don't even know how we know they knew, but
thousands of years of observation.
Right. And an understanding that you are connected, because I think what's happened over the thousands of years is we've grown more and more disconnected. We think we're disconnected. We've just forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about those grassland ecosystems, there was a lot more food there. Even if you just forget about all the wildlife they attract, there's a lot more food in those grasslands than there is in forested areas. You've got all those medicinal plants. A lot of those grassland species and wildflowers are medicinal or edible. They produce edible tubers, or they're producing fruits. And then you've got those clump-forming thickets that would have been in these grasslands, like plums and hazelnuts. But yeah, you'd had plums and hazelnuts and things like that were, these shrubby trees that need grasslands, and they produce edible fruits and seeds. So for them, maintaining that kind of open grassland environment provided them a lot of materials to consume, a lot of materials to make things with, bamboo, cane, rattlesnake master, and things like that they would have used for making clothing and baskets and shoes and bedding and all sorts of things that you couldn't find that in a closed canopy forest. So they saw that and they were like, well, if we want more of these, we got to keep these places open. And then that was excellent for those grassland dependent wildlife species.
That makes so much sense.
Yes. So have you heard of the wilding movement or rewilding movement?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's more of a hands-off, let's just see what happens movement, or is it appropriate intervention, like you're talking about the fires and things? Or is it a whole spectrum? Is it just whatever the practitioner is?
Yeah.
I guess it depends on who you're talking about in the rewilding movement, because I know there's some pretty extreme ones. There's some people who are trying to bring back the woolly mammoth and things like that, which that's really controversial.
Yeah, what?
A lot of people, they just automatically think this is going to be Jurassic Park all over again. But you can use cattle and bison and things like that to, replicate what a lot of those large herbivores were doing. There's a place in Hohenwald, Tennessee, and I am absolutely dying. I hope somebody in Hohenwald is listening to this, because if you are, contact. They have an elephant sanctuary there that is on thousands of acres where these elephants are able to roam free. And I so badly want to walk that property and see what's coming back, because that's kind of is like a rewilding project where you bring back in these large herbivores. And so I'm able to see all the time the effects of fire on the landscape, but I would love to see the effects of a large megafauna on the landscape in North America. I feel like that'd be awesome. And I don't know if anybody's even thought about that when they're, I'm sure they probably have, but I would love to look at that place and see what it looks like, because to me that is a great example of rewilding.
My question is, why did they stop these practices about, I think you said 60 years ago, that kind of turned into forestry? Was it for the forestry industry, or why would that have stopped?
I think it just, places became more populated and people were probably nervous to do it. Plus Smokey the Bear came along, and so everybody started associating fire in forest and fire on the landscape is a bad thing. And so that's probably what changed a lot of people's mindset. And there's still people here that I meet all the time who are, the older generation, who were burning as kids. And then right at that time, Smokey the Bear came along. They stopped burning. People weren't burning the mountains off every year like they used to. And so I think it was a mix of that and people just worried about burning down somebody's house or something, which doesn't happen most of the time. Just probably nervousness, and the place is becoming more populated. And now these mountains around us most of them have houses on them and things like that. And so we've kind of built in these ecosystems where these ecosystems can't function like they used to because we're living there now. So,
and I imagine there's a lack of knowledge about how to manage it as well. I'm sure that was a type of indigenous knowledge that was passed down and at some point stopped. So that's so interesting. I was going to tell how, I think it was in the early 2000s, we took a family vacation out west to Yellowstone. And it was just a year or two after they had one of those big fires out there that just burned down so much of the forested areas. So, it had a look of just utter destruction in a lot of places. It was just burned to the ground, and it was like not what you expect to see in Yellowstone and all that. But it was explained to us that burning is actually necessary to the survival of some of the species, and even some of the seeds require fire to germinate. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Some of those old pines and so forth. So that's a real lesson from nature, and what you're talking about, our hesitancy to burn in our more modern times for very good reason, because we are more densely populated, and it is way more likely to get into some area where people are living or working or whatever. But it's just an interesting juxtaposition. Yeah.
We visited Yellowstone this year. That was my first time going out there. My dad was actually there in the 80s when they had the huge fires out there. And those fires, they're probably a little different than what was naturally occurring beforehand, because there's so much time in between those fires that there's so much fuel built up to where the fires are so intense that it kills almost every tree. It kills all the wildlife. It kills the soil. It burns through the top layer of the soil down to mineral soil to where there's nothing there. And so those wildfires are happening during dry seasons. A lot of these prescribed burns are happening during the cool season and the dormant season when there's a lot more moisture in the soil. So the fire is a lot less intense. And so it's not killing as many trees. All wildlife like box turtles and things are able to survive and underneath that leaf litter because it's not burning all the way down to the mineral soil. And it's just not as intense. So like around here in the southeast, There's some great examples of that. What happens when you're not burning in the landscape, and like, so it's the Smoky Mountains, Gatlinburg. There hadn't been fire there in probably 80 to 100 years. And those mountains, there was so much fuel built up that wildfires happened there. I think it was 2016, and there was like 14 people died because they got so intense.
Yeah.
It was during the wrong time of year, during the dry season, and we made that happen by not allowing it to burn, allowing all that leaf litter to just pile up in those forests for years. And then when the right time comes along where somebody's out there playing arsonist or whatever, those fires are extremely intense to where, we can't stop them. It's killing trees, it's burning down houses and killing people, and it's nothing like the kind of fire that happened here before. And so that's what, in the public eye, people see that and they're like, wow, fire's bad. I don't want that on my property. But that's not what fires were like beforehand. They were happening frequently, and they were less intense, and they were trees and everything were, for the most part, the mature trees were surviving. But we have a lot of fire-dependent trees. And so when the fire gets that hot during the summertime, it even kills the fire-dependent trees. Downsides to wildfires these days is they give people a false perception of what fire was actually like on the landscape.
It's so interesting.
And how did you learn how to do, is it a controlled burn what you do, or how did you learn how to manage it? Was that something you learned at forestry school?
Yeah, most of the time it's not, but actually my forestry school had a burn program where it was called the Fire Dogs, and we do prescribed fires and light fires for state parks and things like that. And then when I was working for the State Fish and Wildlife, we were doing tons of burns there as well. So when I graduated forestry school, I already had a lot of fires under my belt to where I was comfortable going out and doing those burns on my own. And so I was a certified prescribed burn manager when I graduated because I took that certification while I was in college. And so I forgot to take my continuing education classes, so I just had to redo that this year. But it's something you have to get every 5 years.
Prescribed burn specialist. Is that what it's called?
Certified prescribed burn manager.
So this is a program, and schools are training people. And the main purpose is for, you said, state parks and protected areas where there's a lot of management around the land. Whereas what you're doing is you're going into private properties and other places that aren't managed, and you're saying it's worth it to do some
controlled burn.
Yeah, well, and actually a lot of our public lands around here aren't using fire, and they should be, but that are burning quite a bit. The Forest Service does a lot of burning. Some state parks have started. Now, there was a lot of people from state parks at that burn manager training this past couple months, and so hopefully more state parks and more public lands will be doing it. But there are a lot of private lands that do burns as well, and in Alabama, 97% of our land is privately owned. So if private landowners started managing their forest fire incorrectly, they can have a huge impact. So, and it's also important for those public lands to be managing their landscape correctly and not just managing for closed canopy hardwood forests like a lot of them do, because those places that's where these private landowners are going to these state parks and these wildlife refuges, and they're seeing these places, and those places are setting an example for what ecosystems are supposed to look like in Alabama. So if they go there and they see a bunch of invasives, they don't, closed canopy forest with nothing in the understory, there's no grasslands. Everywhere that's open is planted in crops. Everywhere that's closed canopy has a understory of privet. Well, that's what they think wild places are supposed to look like. So they go and manage their private lands the same way by doing nothing. So I think it's really important for those public lands to be managing their forests and ecosystems correctly to set that example for the public.
And that's where your role comes in with your education piece, to just open people's eyes to this issue, because, I'm sure people go to a park or go for a hike or something, and they're hiking through the woods and they look around and they see lots and lots of plants and lots of bushes and trees, and they think, okay, I'm in the woods. But actually, it might not look a thing like it's really supposed to.
Yeah, no.
Is that what you're saying?
There's very few times I've made any of my videos on public lands, just because it's hard to find on a lot of public lands around here. It's hard to find those good ecosystems with a lot of plant diversity there. A lot of the places I'm showing off are on roadsides or on private lands where somebody was probably unknowingly keeping that area open and maintaining biodiversity, probably by accident, just by mowing it maybe once a year, once every couple of years they mowed it. And somehow that kind of what most people would see as an absent landowner or somebody who just didn't take care of their land very well, they were managing their property better than a lot of the public lands around here. So it's kind of crazy and eye-opening.
So fascinating.
And, there's about 1 million things that I would love to tell the public. And a few years ago, it was so frustrating thinking about all this stuff and being like, man, the public doesn't know about it. I wish I wish somebody was out there telling the public about this stuff. And now it's weird to think about. I'm in a position to be able to do that. So
That's awesome. Kyle Lybarger for president. That's so cool. Yeah, TikToks. Save the world with TikTok. I love it.
What are some places that you've discovered that have done a good job with their preserved land and sort of restored what is supposed to be there?
So I found this one plant. It's called Porter's Goldenrod. It only grows, at the time, it was only growing one place in the world, in Giles County, Tennessee. It had been found in Alabama, but it was the population was destroyed when they widened a highway. And so I'd been looking for it. Well, I rediscovered its population, or a population of it, in Alabama on an abandoned lot in between two houses. And this is in like a pretty prominent like neighborhood area. And it just happened to be right down the road from me. And this abandoned lot got mowed once or twice a year. And so the rest of the year is allowed to grow up. And a lot of the time, those grassland species were able to come up and go to seed and drop their seeds. And that ecosystem is a savanna, was able to stay there. And so that's one example of an ecosystem that's kind of been protected just because it wasn't allowed to go to closed canopy forest, and it wasn't getting mowed on a weekly basis to where those native plants disappeared. Another one is ecosystem. It was actually undescribed ecosystem called a Hartsel sandstone barren, and it's found on Hartsel sandstone, which goes across a lot of the state of Alabama. And so there's these grassland ecosystems called glades or barrens where there's a lot of exposed rock. And those glades or barrens are described by what kind of rock is there. So you have limestone barrens, dolomite, sandstone, granite. And so all these grasslands, depending on what rock is there, tells you what kind of plants can exist there. And so each one has different kind of plants that are adapted to them. And so in the whole interior plateau of Alabama, north of the Cumberland Plateau, there had never been a sandstone barren found. And so I found a Hartsel sandstone barren. One was in Moulton, Alabama. And then I ended up finding another one a couple of weeks later, where in my hometown, and it was on a power line right away. So that power line kept it open as a grassland because they'd come through every few years and they would spray those trees to keep the trees from growing up. Right outside the power line right away were these like giant sprawling post oaks that were scattered. There was like maybe 2 or 3 trees per acre of these giant sprawling post oaks that their limbs were touching the ground. Some of them were so old and big. And I looked back at aerial photography from the 40s, and those trees were there at that time. And so underneath those big post oaks now, instead of a grassland, was a solid understory of privet and nandina and all these landscaping plants that have filled this area and taken over the understory. So underneath that privet and nandina was nothing. There was no biodiversity anymore. But because this power line right away was there and they were able to keep it open by spraying trees every now and then, a lot of these grassland species were still there. And I found 2 or 3 county record plants that had never been documented in my county before, and several state listed plants. This is like 12 acres, and it was privately owned by this gentleman. And I contacted him, and he allowed me to go out there and collect seeds and look at this place. Well, fast forward a year, he sells it, and I find out, it's a long story, but with a bunch of coincidences, but I find out that it's been sold to the school system that was right there next to it, the place where I went to school, and they were going to turn part of it into a parking lot. And so I was able to talk with them, and we're going to turn it into a outdoor classroom, which is an undescribed ecosystem within 100 yards of the school that's an outdoor classroom. So that, to me, it's like awesome how that played out. But we just got a grant to start.
Kyle Lybarger for president. I love it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's the best story I've ever heard.
I'm hoping to turn it. I haven't talked about it much in my videos because I'd really love to tell the whole story at once. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. And so what's cool is we have a church in our town. It's not cool, but that sandstone barren used to be huge. Well, in 1916, they turned it into a quarry. And so they quarried all this rock out of it. And in 2022 or 1922, one of our churches in Hartsel was built. Like, my town's called Hartsel too, and that's ironic because this Hartsel sandstone is found across the whole state pretty much. But they built this church in Hartsel out of Hartsel sandstone, and so you can look at this church and see the sandstone where they had destroyed an ecosystem that had never even been described. They destroyed most of it to build this church, which is kind of crazy to think about. But they unfortunately, there's some of it left, and we're able to save it and use it for education. And I just feel like there's so much great educational opportunity there. And And my format is great for a lot of things, short, 1-minute videos, but that story I feel like needs something a little longer. So hopefully I'll be able to tell that story better in the future.
I love these heartwarming stories you're telling. Backing up to a minute ago, before that, you were talking about the untapped potential per se of like, if more people in the state knew about this knowledge. And I love this conversation because it's so hyper-focused on where you are, but also I think it can apply all over the country, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So if more people had access to this education and they understood sort of what's going on, what do you think would motivate people to take action and sort of do what you're doing? Because unfortunately, I'm just going to guess that not everyone cares as much about biodiversity as we do. So
Yeah.
I guess my question is there any sort of economic incentive, or what do you think that would look like for people to be incentivized? Like, that's super cool that the school listened to you and valued that. That's because they're all about education. But I wonder, these private landowners with these hundreds of acres of forest, if you were to go to them and say, you should do this, why would they do it? I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's the thing, is forestry has monetary value to it. Those trees add value to your property. Landowners can cut those trees periodically, pay for their taxes, or if they have a piece of land and they can't afford to keep it in the family, they can, harvest some of the timber off of it and use that money to help keep that land in the family. Well, one of the downsides kind of to grasslands is there's not that obvious way to make income off of grassland. And so I've been trying to figure out ways to make that more obvious. And so native grasses and native grasslands are really great at sequestering carbon. They're way more reliable at sequestering carbon and storing carbon than forests are. And so with forest, your carbon is being stored above ground in the trunk. And so when that wood is harvested and turned into wood products, as long as that wood product is like a house or, staying as flooring and it hasn't been burned or thrown in the dump, then that wood has never been able to rot and release that carbon. But with grasslands, 95% of their carbon is being stored underground. And so when a fire comes through, you're only losing 5% of that carbon that's above the ground. When a major fire comes through a forest and burns everything, you're releasing all that carbon back into the atmosphere. All those trees die, they fall over, they start rotting, releasing that carbon back. And so grasslands are really great at sequestering carbon, and all these tree planting initiatives. There's so much money going into tree planting initiatives and things like that these days, when trees aren't even the best at sequestering carbon. Yeah, they're great when they're young and as long as they're being harvested and storing that carbon somewhere. But if you're just letting them get old and they start going downhill, the amount of carbon they sequester when they're old is a lot less than the amount when it's a young forest. So I think people focus on that so much because there's like this feel good thing. All these companies can say, hey, every time you buy a shirt from us or whatever, we're going to plant a tree. And that sounds good. Well, grasslands, it's harder to say that for grasslands, even though they're better at sequestering carbon and they're better for the environment. And a lot of times those tree planting things are going on in places that weren't historically forests. They would have historically been grasslands. And so I'm a big proponent of managing ecosystems for what they are. Don't try to turn an area into a forest if it doesn't want to be a forest. Do what's best for the land and what the land is telling you that it wants to be. And so maybe some of those carbon credits could be a way that people could make some money with grasslands in the long run, but also through agriculture. These native grasses are excellent grazing for cattle and livestock. You're not able to overgraze them like non-native sawgrasses. You have to rotate them and rotationally graze these native grasses to where you're not grazing them down to the ground. You're allowing them to regrow and grow new, another foot or so before you run cattle back in there again. You're allowing them to go to seed. And so you have to think about it a lot more. You got to be a lot more intentional about how you're grazing these pastures if they're native. And I think a lot of people aren't looking to make that switch because they love to let cows overgraze what's there. And it also makes good hay. It's a really good hay crop as well, and it produces a lot more hay than non-native grasses. So those are some other options to make money off of grasslands.
Then is it not an economic opportunity for people to turn native grasslands into managed grazing areas for sustainably raised beef?
Yeah, there's like Bird for Beef. I think it's Birds for Beef or something like that. The Audubon Society is trying to promote these grasslands for cattle. We just had a podcast guest on for 2 episodes his name Jeff Hodges, and he's an expert on native grasslands and grazing in Missouri. And he just started a podcast, and I'm going to draw a blank. It's like foraging. It's a native foraging podcast, but he's a part of the Foraging Council. And
so the more the word is spread that native grasslands are climate beneficial. And the more that people begin to understand that foraging raised for food is climate beneficial, as opposed to the idea that all meat is bad for the climate, raising meat for consumption, human consumption is bad for the climate, then the more that model can be accepted and adopted, and maybe this would turn the grassland thing into a thriving piece of our economy. Right now, it's just kind of a niche fringe kind of thing. And we just had an interview with White Oak Pastures, and Jenny Harris was the daughter of Will Harris, was explaining to us that it's very hard for regenerative farmers to actually make it these days, because it's just hard for them to transition over and see how it's going to be economically beneficial. But I don't know, the scenario you just painted makes it look more and more promising.
Yeah, there's not a lot of good examples for people to look at out there. And, in Missouri, there's more people doing it, but in the Southeast, there's not a lot of people doing it. And it's because it takes a few years to restore those places. So one thing Jeff said in our podcast, which by the way, his podcast is called Grazing Gone Native with the American Forage Council. He said, take those areas, those pastures that aren't as productive, and convert those to native grasses, because those native grasses will do good in those places where turf grasses aren't going to do very well. So if you have a place that's really wet or really dry or has a lot of sedges or just isn't very productive, convert that to natives and just try it out, test a spot, and you don't have to fertilize it, so that saves you some money there. You're not have to fertilizing. Those roots go down way deeper, so they're bringing up nutrients that traditional turf grasses can't access because their root systems don't go that deep. And so there's just a million benefits to it. And the only downside is that it takes a couple years to turn your pastures into that and get to the point where you have native grasses or native pastures that are able to be grazed rotationally. So,
are you familiar with White Oak Pastures and Will Harris?
I am.
In Georgia. They are in Bluffton, Georgia. Yeah, he's been doing it for about 30 years.
I learned about him last year. A person in the beef industry contacted me and told me about him, and then they actually commented on one of my videos last week about possibly coming down. So I'd love to see their place sometime.
Oh my gosh, that would be so cool.
Connections.
It's so funny. I really recently been thinking about this idea of like wide grasslands and ranching, because we've interviewed a few people on the podcast and we love everything that's going on in California with the regenerative movement. And they have these huge swath, hundreds of thousands of acres of grasslands that they're converting to native and all of this. And it's always seemed like something that they do in California or the Midwest, like you're saying. And I've always just thought, we don't have that on the East Coast, or we don't have that in the Southeast. But I guess what you're kind of saying is we used to, or we could have that, maybe. Mm-hmm. Is that a thing? Yeah. Or do you think we're populated, or I don't know?
We were settled a lot earlier than California and the Midwest. So our grasslands, they were destroyed generations before a lot of the grasslands in the Midwest or the West Coast were destroyed. We immediately came in and we took any piece of productive ground that was open and we turned it into crop fields, or we overgrazed them to where they weren't there anymore. So that history of grasslands in the Southeast is so far back that we just don't remember it. You don't find them anymore. You don't find those large intact grasslands like that used to be here. And that's the reason why a lot of the grasslands I come across are really rocky sites, or they're savannas with a lot of trees. And it's because those spots weren't the best crop ground or weren't the best areas to graze a lot of cattle on. And so that's why they've kind of been able to survive. And grasses love those rocky areas, but that's not the only place they would have been. They would have been in those tall grass prairies, those really rich soils that now have been turned into ag fields. And those ag fields are being turned into neighborhoods around here. So
it's also funny that you talk about the areas around power lines being some really prime examples of this. And I really love that, because sometimes you'll drive past them, you're on the highway or even a back road, and you'll cross one of those power line areas. And sometimes it's so easy to think, the power lines are such an eyesore and that's so sad. This is such a beautiful area, but there's a power line. But now it's kind of clicking in my head. They're beautiful because the power lines are there.
Yeah.
And it's true. Some of the most beautiful meadows and wild places are around power lines. That's so funny.
Mm-hmm.
They're managed.
Yeah.
It's like a little sliver into the past that you can look down and see those rolling hills and see the grass, kind of imagine what used to be there. But it's just a tiny, skinny little sliver of what's left. And it was probably even more diverse than what's there now. Beforehand, there's some of that diversity probably has been lost, but it's really cool to look at those places and imagine what everything used to look like. And those power lines make pretty good examples of that.
I will add here that there's a difference in managing for native grasses and just mowing and blowing your lawn. We're not talking about just keeping things mowed down, right?
So, our native grasses, they can't handle that being mowed down to the ground. That's not how they would have naturally. That's like mowing over the flowers in your flower bed and thinking that they're mid-bloom and you're going to mow them over and you think that's going to be good for them. And it just a lot of times kills them and knocks them back, or after several mowings, they're killed. They've used up all their resources. But turf grasses are made. They're good at being mowed and growing low and spreading through rhizomes, and they don't even need to go to seed to spread. They can spread through those rhizomes. So overgrazing, mowing, when you do that, you're promoting non-native grasses in those areas. You're promoting turf grasses to survive and nothing else survive in that area. And so really, allowing those wildflowers and those native grasses to grow up and go to seed is what's most important. And mowing in the dormant season occasionally isn't a bad thing. Or I burn mine off in the winter. I'll burn my meadows and back half of my property, and then next year they come back even better and more diverse, and they look more full and more. Been cool to watch them progress over the years and how they've become more diverse, and they just look better. This year's been awesome. I've had patches of there might be swamp milkweed come up over here, and then in 3 years I've been able to watch that swamp milkweed spread across my meadow because I've allowed it to go to seed, and those seeds are able to spread, and it's just kind of cool to watch that progression happen.
We're in the process of converting our back paddock that we don't really need for the pony grazing into a native area. Sort of don't know what I'm doing, but talking to people like you helps. I think we let it grow this summer just to see, and it was just not many things that we hope to see there in the future. There was very little milkweed. There was a lot of stuff not things that the pollinators would like. So we mowed it back down, and now are trying to plant things and spread seed and stuff. So we'll see what happens next spring.
In that case, sometimes the best thing you could so my pasture used to be like that, and I let it grow up, and it was nothing but undesirable non-natives, and so it was mostly fescue and things like that. So I went through there and I sprayed. And I killed with grass selective herbicide. I killed off all those non-native grasses. And so what came back was it had to be, forbs. And so among those forbs were mostly natives. And if there were non-natives, I spot sprayed those and then allowed room for those natives to fill into those areas. And that's one thing I try to promote to people is herbicides are my number one enemy for a lot of my grassland remnants. The worst thing that could happen is for somebody to come through there and spray those places. And I hate people who are spraying with no regards as to what's there. That being said, in the battle against invasives and non-natives, herbicides are our best friend. You cannot restore a lot of these places I'm restoring without herbicides. And so whether that's spot spraying, and you don't have to do the broad spectrum or you're broadcasting the whole entire area and doing it repetitively like a lot of agriculture does. This is small amounts, and you're applying them directly into those onto those problem areas. You're not applying them across the entire area. So you can do it in a way to where the amount of spraying you're doing is minimal, but it's benefiting those native plants. And I saw a great example of that this year. Kogan grass was taking over a spot down in the Black Belt, and the landowner he's going around spraying all these places with Kogan grass, and they look like deserts. A month after he sprays them, it's like a desert. He showed me some areas where it's been 2-3 years after he sprayed them, and there wasn't a bit of Kogan grass there anymore, and all the native species filled back into that area. And it was more, that spot where that Kogan grass was, where he sprayed, was more diverse than 99% of the places I see on properties in Alabama. It was incredible to see that diversity return even after an invasive had been there and it got sprayed. So when people ask me, they're like, what should I do to restore my pasture? I'm like, the way you would approach it, there's about 1 million ways to approach it, and it depends on what you have there, what invasives you have, what natives you have. You could have invasives, but you could have some really rare native plants, and my recommendations are going to be a lot different. I'm not going to tell you to go through there and start spraying something when there's, really rare plants in there with those invasives. So it kind of changes. Each situation deserves a different prescription. And so you kind of have to observe it and say, what are the problems I'm having and how should I approach it to best promote biodiversity here.
What do you think about those flame weeder things where they kind of torch something?
So it does the same thing as burning. And so burning helps. And I burn my pasture all the time, but it's not going to kill those non-native grasses. If certain times of the year, if I'm burning in the winter, it'll kill the fescue. It is easier to get rid of fescue than anything else with fire, but you're still going to have those. There's still going to be non-natives living there. It's not going to kill them. You can burn for years and years and years and years and still have those invasives thriving and reproducing and dropping seeds. And that's not what you want. Every year you allow those non-natives to thrive and drop seeds and reproduce, you're doubling your problem. And so if you can spray them once now and kill them, instead of letting them go to seed and have to spray 2-3 times the amount and have to force your neighbors to spray populations of those invasives, then to me, that's the smart thing to do and the responsible thing to do is spray once and deal with the issue instead of letting the issue get huge to where it might not be you, but it may be the future landowner has to go through there and just spray the whole entire area and start over from scratch because this Sericea lespedeza has taken over the entire field or something, you know.
What's the common name for that plant you just named? Is there a common name for it?
I just call it Sericea lespedeza. It's one that I only know it as its scientific name. So
I'm thinking like horseweed. Are you familiar with horseweed?
Yeah.
Got a lot of that.
Yeah, and that one cycles out. That's one that, you know, I had a lot of my pasture to begin with. As my meadows kind of matured, I'm seeing less and less of that. It's getting out competed by the natives. So it's good to know which of those species or how they behave, how those invasive or the undesirables behave, and that kind of help you figure out what kind of plan to approach it with. And I have a Facebook page that's a really great resource for that. It's called Native Habitat Managers, and it's a group on Facebook. So if you have any of those questions about a certain invasive and how to approach it, that's a great resource because like all the professionals who manage native habitat in every state are on that page and are always open to giving advice and being helpful. So
yeah. Kyle, that's awesome. What a service.
I will definitely go on there.
It's a great resource because there's everybody from hunters to home gardeners to botanists and foresters, native plant enthusiasts, native nursery owners, people who own giant prairies. And it's just like a melting pot of just all these different outdoor enthusiasts. And it was a dream of ours to make it a place where all these people can give each other advice and not talk politics or argue. And that's exactly what it's become. It's been pretty awesome to see.
The coolest. I love this sector of humans because it's such a cross section of everything else, but united over this
plants.
Really important thing. It's so beautiful.
What's the name of the Facebook page again? I want to go straight there.
It's called Native Habitat Managers. And so awesome. Right now everybody's doing a lot of seed collection. So it's a great resource for if you're wondering how to collect a certain seed from a certain species and how to store it in order to germinate it or stratify it later on. It's a great place to ask those kind of questions too.
So what are we going to do about tiny little thing called industrial agriculture commodity farming? Just kidding. What would it look like if we converted the hundreds of thousands of acres in the country that are not productive anymore into native grasslands? Is that something you've thought about?
We'd get a lot of wildlife species back that were in decline, bobwhite, and, our biodiversity would obviously shoot through the roof. Those places that are just, maybe have a couple weed species out there now or non-natives, then have sometimes hundreds of species of natives that a lot of insects depend on, and those songbirds depend on those insects. And so I think wildlife numbers would just explode. And that's a good thing for humans too, because we depend on wildlife as a food source too. There's a lot of us, especially in the Southeast. I know a lot of the households here consume deer meat year round or game that they've hunted for, quail and turkeys and rabbits and things like that. So I feel like we might be getting rid of some space that we use as a food source, but we'd be creating more space that would help us secure a food source and at the same time support biodiversity and plant diversity and insect and wildlife diversity for future generations. And I feel like that's really a huge responsibility of ours, is to make sure these things stay here for future generations.
And a more secure food source too, because what it would be replacing whether it's corn or soybeans or something.
Yeah.
You can't like walk up to a stalk of commodity corn and eat it. So I love what you're saying. It makes so much sense to me.
And I learned today from Kyle the tremendous carbon sequestration potential of grasslands. So,
Yeah. Converting a lot of those non-native pastures to native pastures would be huge. I mean, our biggest crop is lawn grass and yards. Our yards are our biggest crop across the U.S. And I mean, converting part of those yards to native meadow, using that as an area for you to recreate and walk through in the afternoons, the impact that would have would be huge. And so, yeah, croplands and agriculture, we need to focus on those. But I think, yards, I think that might be the biggest issue and the easiest one to tackle up front. But my yard, I bought my parents' place where I grew up, and we have 5 acres, and the whole property used to be mowed. And now, I'm only mowing maybe half an acre. And so most of it is native meadow now. And the amount of things that I've seen return to the landscape that weren't here when I was a kid. And believe me, when I was a kid, I was paying attention because I was out there catching snakes and frogs and lizards. And I was so mad that because my friends' houses would have like more lizards than my house has. And now there's lizards everywhere here because we have insects and we have, an intact ecosystem now. And so I've been able to watch this like ecosystem come back to life. But yards, I think, is one of the biggest places I think we can tackle and make a huge difference. Is we don't need everything doesn't need to be mowed.
That's such a good point. I'm like, take down corn, and you're like, just start with a lawn.
Well, both work. I mean, in that farming, you can have like prairie strips through those, ag fields, and that in itself would be huge for water quality and stuff. But think about this too. When you think about carbon, we've lost in some states, 99% of our grasslands, over 90% of our grasslands across the country. And our grasslands are more reliable at storing carbon than forest. Yet our solution to that is to plant more forest. And this is coming from a forester, somebody who loves trees and forests. I think the answer is right there in front of our eyes, and we're blinded by the trees. We can't see the forest for the trees, but we can't see the grasslands for the trees, I guess.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, I would just like to say to our listeners, people wonder what they can do about climate change and how they can help and the action they can take. And I'm just proposing right now that people take a small section. If you have a yard or you have any green space around you at all, just dedicate a small section of that to growing some native plants or stop mowing one little corner of your yard or one little strip or something and just play around with this. It can be as small as you want it to be, but start somewhere. And whatever you do is going to be helpful. And I will say this, having done it myself to more and more of a degree every year, we're trying to decrease our grass and increase natives. You will be amazed at the butterflies and birds and, like you say, insects that show up just when you offer them a couple of little plants. It's amazing. The response is so obvious. So
I have a question about that. So I have a lawn. I might be say I'm in a suburb or, I'm somewhere where I'm allowed to do this, right? I'm not like working under any restrictions, or maybe I have a little bit more land. But so do I just stop mowing, or do I do what you were saying earlier, Kyle? Do I need to kill some non-invasives for like, how do I set the stage for that? I know y'all have kind of done a lot of different stuff, Mom, but for someone who's listening and they're like, okay, cool, I want to do this. What do they do?
Yeah, so that's a great question because, you see these movements like no-mow and things like that. And it depends on what you have, because if you have a bunch of, like in my yard, there's Bahia. There's a lot of good natives out there too, but there's like Bahia and Bermuda and fescue and stuff. If you're allowing those to grow up and go to seeds and drop those seeds, and then it rains and all those seeds are washed down and go all these places, and you're helping those non-native grasses spread. So yeah, it's a good thing, but make sure you know what's there before you let it grow up. Don't let these invasives go to seed and spread. Fortunately, in my yard, I have a ton of native sedges, and I have spring beauties and blue-eyed grass and lyre-leaf sage and some Mount Coreopsis and a lot of low-growing natives that can be mowed. And so I'm gradually spraying grass-selective herbicides to kill those turf grasses and kind of convert my yard over to weeds. It doesn't have that weedy look because a lot of those look like grasses, and especially the sedges. Yeah, just know what you have there first before you let it go to seed and grow up.
I've been spreading violets everywhere.
Yeah,
because they're really pretty and they make a nice little green bunch, and they're native here.
Yeah, that's a great one for that. And there's a lot of great different native grasses and sedges and things that work well for, that lawn look that people want. And I think that's, well, a lawn has a place because people want it mowed and be able to see where they're walking. There's a lot of great natives that give you that lawn look, but then also take some of your lawn out of production, out of being mowed, and let it grow up and make a garden, a little winding strip of, prairie grasses and wildflowers through your yard. And you can make it look intentional, make it look good, and it's good for the environment, and it's going to be way better than a lawn is.
So Lady Farmer, our tagline is sowing seeds of slow living. So we like to have our conversations go back to sustainability and slow living. And we like to ask, what does slow living mean to you?
I was raised by a man who never sat down. And so it's hard for me to slow down. But, to me, even as somebody who's fast paced and always has to be doing something, being outdoors with your family, I think a lot of times, to me, what slowing down looks like in my life is hunting. A lot of the times just sitting there and procuring food for my family from, something that consumed native plants its whole life. And I know it's good, healthy meat for my family. We do a lot of gardening and we have chickens and we spend a lot of time outdoors, and it all revolves around somewhat, being self-sustainable. And our prairie behind our house has different plants back there that we can use to consume and forage and things like that. To me, those are the moments when I feel most human. And seed collecting too. I'm doing a lot of seed collecting for prairie stuff right now. And there's just something about being out there harvesting seed by hand. It kind of puts you in this state where you're just like, it slows you down and relaxed and you feel like a human again. So any of those kind of being able to feed yourself and be outdoors, I feel like that really encapsulates that slow living and makes you feel like a human and like your great-great-grandparents probably were. They were growing a lot of their food. And so there's a lot of connection there, and it just feels, for somebody who's fast-paced, that's when I slow down the most, I guess.
That's so true. I think you're the first person on this podcast to say hunting. And
Yeah.
it's so true. Like, I've gone hunting once, and it was very slow. I sit there for a long time. It's so true. But you also are so connected, and you're so observant, and you have to really immerse yourself. So it's a privilege to be able to do that.
And I feel like I kind of earned it too, because, I'm taking something from the ecosystem, but I make a point to give so much back to those ecosystems and make them better. So, I'm not saying most hunters don't do that, but there is something to say about when you're taking something from an ecosystem, make sure you're giving more back than you're taking.
You're honoring reciprocity, which I think is key to sustainability, actually.
Yeah.
So what does the good dirt mean to you, Kyle? And you can answer that any way you want.
I can take it literally. Everybody likes some good dirt, talking drama. But for me, I guess the good dirt is kind of like the foundation, I guess, the soil, and having a good foundation to live off of. And metaphorically, I guess, if you have that good foundation and good morals to live by and make everything intentional, try to do things right the first time when you're doing things and saying, hey, what I'm doing here to this landscape, whether it's landscaping or growing your food or whatever, how is this going to affect this place down the road? And a lot will grow from making those decisions in your life. And a lot will grow from that and turn your life into so much more. And you'll find a lot of joy and a lot of happiness in those areas. And I don't know, that's to me, it all kind of starts there at the foundation for native plants and stuff, the soil, having good soil health in your life, having that good foundation to grow from. It's made a difference in my life. And I haven't talked about this much. I don't talk about this usually on podcasts, but my father was like a really, really, really great man, and he raised us outdoors. He never slowed down. He was, just extremely hardworking, made sure he did everything right the first time. So I learned that from him, taking the time to do things the correct way. And in 2017, I graduated from forestry school that spring, and then that fall, I married my wife. She had a 3-year-old daughter, and then while we were on our honeymoon, he passed away from a random heart attack. And he was out collecting pecans from a pecan tree, and this is a tree that we'd gone to like every year growing up, and he'd knock them out of the tree with a cane pole. And so it was kind of full circle. It was a lot of bad to it, I guess, because I was on my honeymoon. It was my sister's birthday, but man, that moment there when losing him, it kind of really changed my life to look, what am I doing with my life, and how can I had a lot to live up to. He was just such a great person. And so that kind of, man, that's I guess, good dirt. That's kind of what I was raised from. The person who raised me turned me into this. And so making sure you have good morals, it does a lot for you when you're raising a family and you have, kids to raise and set an example for is do things the right way and try to take care of the planet and try to leave something better for the next generation. So that's kind of
perfect. That's the good dirt.
That is.
Thank you for sharing. That's so beautiful.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I mean, this has been so lovely talking to you. I'm so excited. I hope we get to chat again and we can stay in touch and all of those things. The last question we like to ask is, well, if there's anything else you want to say, or if there's anything you'd like to leave the audience with, what do you want people to most understand about the work that you're doing?
Well, I'd like to start by saying I think y'all are doing a great thing, getting people to slow down and learn where their food comes from, learn where all these things that we take in with our lives, I've listened to some of y'all's podcasts, clothing and everything we use, it comes from somewhere, and slowing down to look at that. Y'all are doing a great thing with this podcast. But if you'd like to watch my stuff, I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Native Habitat Project. It's Native Plant Talk on TikTok. Our podcast is Native Habitat Podcast. And so it gets confusing because then, that Facebook group I mentioned earlier is Native Habitat Managers. So it's just, we went with the whole Native Habitat thing and it's confusing now. But so you can find me in any of those places. And so I'm out there, I find these places on private lands and on roadsides that are really important and have rare plants and have rare ecosystems, and they're at risk of being mowed. They're at risk of being unmanaged and growing up into invasives. And so I've spent a lot of time out there managing these places, putting up signs on my own time, on my own dime. And I've been doing that for years. Thankfully, in the last year, through social media and everything, people, with the Native Habitat Project starting, people wanted to help out. And so we have a Patreon, and that's where people are able to help us fulfill some of those tasks and manage these places, buy signs and protect them, and really focus on saving rare ecosystems on private lands, which I think is really important in a state that's 97% privately owned, and a lot of other states are in that same situation. But that's where you can find us on Patreon if you'd like to support us and help us save some more of these places. So.
Definitely. Add one more shout out too about just Alabama. I think people don't realize how beautiful Alabama is. And to your point, it's mostly private, but there are some beautiful public places you can go. And I just think nobody knows, especially northern Alabama. And all of it, but Alabama's a gem of a state that people, I don't think it's necessarily a tourist destination.
Yeah, it's a great place. I wouldn't live anywhere else. So.
I just want to say I enjoyed talking to you so much, Kyle. I think I could talk to you all day. You're so interesting in all of your knowledge, and I'm so curious about all of this and so eager to experiment in my own place with all of these things. And I do things from year to year, but I always want to know more. And really, really thank you so much for spending the time with us today. It's been so valuable. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too.
So thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate y'all having me on. We'll see y'all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at We Are Lady Farmer. That's We Are Lady Farmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.